So, you want to buy a next-gen console, but which one should you buy? Let's find out. What's up everybody, I'm Seth Fowler, and today we're taking a look at the two next-gen consoles, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, and we're finding out which one is best for you. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Make sure to hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't yet, and also make sure to give me a follow on Instagram and on Twitter at RealSethFowler. Also, if you want to win a PlayStation 5 digital edition for yourself, because I know they're extremely hard to grab right now, I'm actually giving away one. In fact, that one right back there. All you have to do to enter to win is subscribe to this channel, follow me on Instagram at RealSethFowler, and then comment "done" underneath the picture of that console on my Instagram. But for this video, I wanted to focus on the two highest end consoles, the PlayStation 5 Standard and the Xbox Series X, mainly because those are the two most powerful versions, but also because I think they're going to be the two most popular versions. So, the main purpose of this video is to not tell you which console is better, because I think they're both pretty even when it comes to most things, but it's actually to help you determine which console is better for you. So at this point, I've had both of these consoles for about a week, and I've been playing them a bunch. And I've got to say, you can't really go wrong with either console. And the nice thing is that the price of both of these consoles is exactly the same at $499 US, and spec-wise, they're both pretty similar, although apparently the Xbox Series X is just a tad bit more powerful. And actually, another thing that both of these consoles have in common is that they're both very quiet, which is a pretty big departure from the previous consoles from last generation. And I've got to say, even under heavy load, like when I'm playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla on the Xbox Series X or Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PlayStation 4, they're both almost silent. They put out a lot of heat, but they're both pretty silent. And actually, while we're on the similarities, let's just knock out all the similarities at once. Both of these consoles have basically no load times at all. It's incredible how fast these consoles load these next generation games, and they both have ray tracing. So no matter what console you get, you're going to have basically no load times. You're going to have much better graphics than you had in the past, including ray tracing, and you're also going to have a console that's pretty quiet. And graphically, when it comes to third-party games, these consoles are both almost exactly the same. Again, the Xbox Series X is technically more powerful, and I guess in the future, a couple years down the road, you may notice some slightly better graphical performance on third-party games, but that's not guaranteed and really just depends on the developer. I really can't stress this enough, but both consoles are excellent, and no matter what console you get, you're going to be happy with it. But now let's get to the differences, which is probably the reason you came to this video in the first place, and the first difference I wanted to talk about is design. There is one very obvious difference between the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, and that's size. The PlayStation 5 is huge. The PlayStation 5 is by far the largest modern home gaming console. It's ridiculously huge, and it's surprisingly heavy, especially if you buy the standard edition with the Blu-ray drive. And what's unfortunate is that this console will have a lot of trouble fitting into people's TV stands. I'm not proud of this, but I bought a whole new TV stand specifically designed to hold the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. I had to measure it out, make sure it all fit, and it fits, but barely. And I was planning for it. That's the craziest part. However, while this console is huge, I personally love the way it looks. I get it, I'm an industrial design nerd. I love really crazy forms and really modern looking things, and I know a lot of people don't like the way that this console looks, but for me, I think this is one of the best looking consoles that's ever come out. I know I'm gonna get a lot of comments in the comment section down below about people saying that I'm crazy, but genuinely, I think it's a good looking console. I would say the digital edition much more so than the standard edition, but I think the PS5 is pretty sleek. On the other side of the aisle, we've got the Xbox Series X, which takes a completely different approach to industrial design. This console is basically just a square that's been extruded upwards. It's just a rectangle. And you know what? I'm into it as well. I love the minimal aesthetic of this console. I love how it looks like a monolith. I love the way that if you look at the top of the console, you can see this really cool green accent that's painted into the ventilation holes on the top. The one thing I'm not a huge fan of the Xbox Series X is how it looks when it's laid on its side. I don't think it's a bad looking console, it just looks very boring. When it's vertical though, I think it looks incredible. I think it's a beautifully designed console, and I think the industrial design team at Microsoft knocked it out of the park. Design-wise though, there is one thing that I don't like about either consoles, and that's that both consoles require a stand. The Xbox Series X's stand is built in. It's this little circle pad on the bottom of the console, which I kind of wish that you could remove because I don't like the way that it looks when it's laying on its side, but at least it's attached to the console. The PlayStation 5 stand is not only required because the console won't stand upright or lay on its side without it. I mean, it can sort of stand upright without it, but it's a little bit wobbly. It's just crazy to me that they had to literally provide a stand with the console in order for you to be able to use it. Like, that's nuts. And I bet you it was actually a pretty large expense for Sony. Not in the overall percentage of price that the console costs, but in the overall amount that they had to make for every console and the amount that they had to spend to make stands for every single console. Plus, it kind of sucks that you just can't lose the stand, and if you lose the stand, you're kind of screwed. That's the one design thing that I really don't like about the PlayStation 5, and that's where I think the Xbox Series X, design-wise, probably has it beat. Now, before we round off the subject of design, just to explain why the PlayStation 5 is so large, even though it's less powerful than the Xbox Series X, the reason this console is so huge is because PlayStation really prioritized ventilation and cooling. This console was built to stay cool, which I really appreciate about it, and because of that, I think it's going to last longer. But now let's move on to the controllers, which honestly might be the most important part because you're going to be touching that part of the console more than any other part. The Xbox Series X's controller, or Xbox Series controller, remains almost unchanged from the previous controller. And not only that, you can actually use your Xbox One controller on the Xbox Series X, so it almost takes away any need to buy a second Xbox Series controller. If you saw this controller from a distance, you might not even realize that it's any different than the Xbox One's controller. And the only real changes are that you've got a slightly different D-pad, the top of the controller doesn't have that little divot anymore, you've got a share button now, which who's really going to use that? I mean, I'm sure people will, but I've never used it once on the PlayStation 4, so I don't see myself using it on the Xbox Series X. And then on the back of the controller and on the shoulder buttons, you've actually got this new texture which provides some surprisingly nice grip. What's crazy to me is that this textured grip is actually the largest difference between this controller and last generation's controller, and it really does make genuinely a surprisingly large difference. Even when your hands are getting a little sweaty, you never feel like the controller is going to slip out of your hands because the grip really holds it in place, and it also really helps to have these matte textured shoulder buttons too for the same reason. This is truly a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and they didn't. I will say that the slight iterative changes that they made on the controller did make a difference, and they also added a USB-C on the back of the controller. However, they're still using standard AA batteries, which kind of sucks. Let's be honest, it kind of sucks. So I guess the best way to put it is the Xbox Series controller was a nice half step forward. It didn't take any risks, but it also made the controller slightly better than last year's version. But now let's move on to the PlayStation 5's DualSense controller, and in my opinion, this is where the PlayStation 5 really shines. The DualSense controller is not only a complete visual redesign from the DualShock from last generation, but it's also a complete internal overhaul. In my opinion, the DualSense controller is the reason that the PlayStation 5 feels like a next-gen console, and the Xbox Series X feels like a mid-cycle refresh. The Sony DualSense controller now features some of the most incredible haptic feedback I've ever felt in a controller, and it features adaptive triggers. So first, let's talk about the haptic feedback. When you play a game like Astrobot's Playroom, where you walk around this crazy landscape, which is really just kind of an example of what the controller can do, you really start to feel the different textures on the ground. Like, you feel the sand that you're walking through, you feel the rain falling on top of you. The DualSense controller creates such an insanely immersive experience by just having really accurate vibrations in your hands. It's crazy. Actually, if you own a Nintendo Switch and you've played 1-2 Switch, you almost know exactly how that feels. It's almost the exact same experience that you would have on a Nintendo Switch. And to be fair, that part of the controller might not be the most next-gen part of the controller, but it's definitely something that pushes this console forward. But what really sets this controller apart is the insane adaptive triggers. Now, inside each side of the controller, you've actually got a motor that changes the tension on the triggers. So what's crazy is that these triggers get more difficult to press depending on the environment or situation or weapon that you're using in the game. So for example, in Call of Duty Cold War, depending on the weapon that you're using in the game, the sensitivity of the trigger changes. Not only that, but when you actually fire the gun, the haptics in the controller go off as well, so it really feels like you're getting some crazy recoil. It's an insane experience and truly makes this feel like a next-gen console. But the craziest experience that I had actually happened when I was playing NBA 2K21, which I know is really just a game that feels like more of the same, at least gameplay-wise. When you're running down court, depending on how tired your player is, the harder it will be to pull the trigger. So if your player is super tired, it's really difficult to pull the trigger to run, but if he's good to go and he's fresh, it's like pulling a regular trigger on a regular controller. It is truly an immersive experience, and one that I never thought I'd have in NBA 2K, and I love it. I've been playing that game so much more than I usually do. So in my opinion, the adaptive triggers are the biggest change on this controller, and actually the entire console as well. But I've got to say, the rest of the controller is also pretty solid. The DualSense controller is actually bigger than the Xbox Series X controller, which is the first time that I think a PlayStation controller has been bigger than an Xbox controller, and it actually feels really good in the hands. The face buttons on the controller now come in this PSP-esque clear look, which I'm really into. Of course, you've still got your touchpad in the center. You've got your light bar, which is now off to the side of the touchpad instead of being on top of it. The controller now features a USB-C port on the back instead of micro USB, which I definitely prefer. Analog sticks generally are relatively the same other than a texture change. The PlayStation button in the center of the controller is now no longer just a circle. It's actually cut out in the shape of the PlayStation button, which is not a big change, but really made a big difference to me. I don't know why, I just love that detail. And then the final major difference is now this controller has a built-in microphone. So you've got a microphone and a speaker. So now if I'm voice chatting on a game, I'm usually doing it through just the controller. Granted, it is a little quiet, but it still works out. Oh, and of course, you've also got a little mute button right there underneath the PlayStation logo, just in case you want to mute the controller if you're like mom's yelling at you or something like that. So when it comes to controllers, I think the PlayStation 5's DualSense controller is by far the much more modern controller. I think this is definitely a controller that makes you feel like you're playing in the next generation, and it really is the biggest change between both consoles in general. It's crazy that just a controller is the largest leap forward, or at least it feels like the largest leap forward, but it truly is. But now let's get to by far the most important thing, and that's the games. And this is where things get very subjective, because I really think it depends on the games that you like to play. When it comes to system exclusive launch titles, in terms of quantity, the PlayStation 5 has the Xbox Series beat by a mile, because it's actually got some. The PlayStation 5 has games like Spider-Man Miles Morales, Bugsnax, Demon's Souls, and Astrobot's Playroom, which are all pretty solid games. The Xbox Series X was supposed to have Halo Infinite, but now it doesn't. So that's kind of the extent of it when it comes to exclusives. Now, to be fair, I really think that's kind of an unfair comparison, because the Xbox Series X still has a bunch of third-party games you can play like Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and the biggest thing of all, it's got Game Pass, which allows you a bunch of access to a ton of different games from a ton of different console generations. So yeah, if you're just purely basing your buying decision off purely launch exclusive titles, the PlayStation 5 is really the only way to go. However, if you're basing your decision off the amount of games that you can play, the Xbox Series X, I think, is the winner. And the reason for that is that while the PlayStation 5 is pretty much backwards compatible with the PS4 with the exception of a couple games, the Xbox Series X is not only compatible with Xbox One games, but also some Xbox 360 games and even some Xbox Originals games. Also, like I said, it's got Game Pass, which is incredible and gives you access to a bunch of different games. So Xbox Game Pass, if you're not familiar, is a monthly subscription service that gives you access to over 100 different games that you can download from the Xbox store at any time. PlayStation sort of has an answer to that with PlayStation Now, but it doesn't have anywhere close to the catalog that the Xbox Game Pass has. And honestly, I use Game Pass all the time, and I've never even really tried PlayStation Now, so I guess that's really only if you value my opinion, but I think objectively, Game Pass is better than PlayStation Now, at least at the moment. So if the overall quantity of games that you can play is more important to you than exclusives, the Xbox is definitely the way to go, at least right now. And even though right now the Xbox doesn't really have any exclusives, it's gonna have a bunch in the next couple years. Not only that, but Microsoft also just bought a bunch of huge studios like Bethesda, so in theory, Elder Scrolls could be an exclusive to Xbox. Probably not the one coming up, but the one after that. So you could say that the Xbox has a potential to have more exclusives in the future, but the PlayStation 5 definitely has much more exclusives now. But again, I really think it depends on the kind of games that you like to play, and by now you should know what sort of games come out on PlayStation and what sort of games come out on Xbox. But honestly, most of the games that you're going to be playing right now, and probably most of the games that you're going to be playing online, are going to be third-party games that are on both consoles. One thing that kind of disappoints me about both consoles is their storage size. They both have SSDs, which means they're going to have incredibly fast storage. You're going to be able to load games incredibly quickly, which we've already talked about. However, because they're SSDs, they're a little bit smaller than I think we would like. The PlayStation 5 has an 825 gigabyte SSD, and as of right now, it doesn't have expandable storage. I mean, you can technically buy expandable storage for it, you just can't install it yet. There's no firmware for it yet. The Xbox Series X comes with a full terabyte SSD, which is 175 gigabytes more than the PlayStation 5, and it actually offers expandable storage. However, that is proprietary, it's from Seagate, and it costs almost as much as the console. I'm not kidding, it's crazy expensive. And this is where it kind of sucks, because even if you buy the discs for these consoles, which I have been doing, they're still going to install these massive files on your consoles, and you're still going to eat up that space insanely quickly. I mean, Call of Duty is like hundreds of gigs, Master Chief Collection is hundreds of gigs. You're really going to be using up a lot of space really quickly. And at this moment in time, the PlayStation 5 is definitely at a disadvantage here because it's got less gigs to start and it doesn't have expandable options. So to wrap this all up and just put a nice little bow on it, it really depends on the games that you want to play. And that's really a decision that you have to make on your own. You know the game libraries that PlayStation and Xbox have. You have to decide based on those game libraries which games you're planning to play more, and that should really help inform the decision of which console you want more. Now I will say, when it comes to cool factor and next-gen NES, the PlayStation 5 definitely has the Xbox beat. The Xbox kind of feels like a slightly newer version of the Xbox One, whereas the PlayStation 5, at least with that controller, it really does feel like the next generation of consoles. So hey, if you can only get one of these, and the most important thing to you is feeling like you have a next-gen console, the PlayStation 5 is the easy choice. But if you're a huge Halo player and you love Xbox exclusives, the Xbox is the way to go. You really can't make a wrong choice. But at this point, I would love to know your thoughts and whether you prefer the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X, and why you prefer that particular console. So make sure to let me know in the comment section down below. Once again, don't forget to enter my PlayStation 5 Digital Edition console giveaway. All the links that you need to enter are in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you all in the next one.